Now, assuming we're hale and hearty, I suppose it's fair to say most of us would want to live for as long as possible. I mean, it's perverse not to, I suppose. And the idea now that, we could live to 100 is increasingly possible, it seems. And I suppose, the old 80 is today's 100 in a way. And I think we are seeing in quite short periods of time this longevity thing moving quite quickly. So 100 is now not so unusual. But what's the single biggest factor that will stop you getting to 100? Well, some researchers at the George Washington University have had a look at that. And they think that the single biggest factor is eating processed food. And it's for lots of reasons we know anyway that processed food has all sorts of problems with our biophysical makeup. It triggers diabetes, heart problems, and so forth, which of course on its own seems to cut years off your life. And that certainly is true, but it seems to also have profound effects on key biological process, which include our gut microbiome, the universe of bacteria, and blood glucose levels. And these are all key to living a long and healthy life. And eating processed foods on a regular basis, as so many, especially in the States, but everywhere, do, is having a big effect. And they looked at the average folks in the States and compared them with older people in what is called the blue zones, which are these special areas of the world where people regularly live to 100 and older. And this is the stark difference in the two lifestyles. The average people in the West were eating quite a lot of processed foods, and included potato chips, sugar-sweetened drinks, sweets, refined grains, and processed meat, compared to those in blue zones who were eating little or none of those foods. And it seems that they took away the idea that really of everything that we do, the diet, and in particular a bad diet, had far more impact on longevity than anything else that we do. And so instead of processed foods, they recommend eating whole vegetables, legumes, nuts, fruit, and plenty of water, they say. What do you think, Lynn? Does that sort of make sense, doesn't it?
Well, it does, because we know that the genesis of so many of these degenerative diseases is sugar. They're now starting to say that heart disease isn't so much about blockages as inflammation. We know that many of the other ones, diabetes, etc., Alzheimer's, are about inflammation. And we also know that sugar is a big source of inflammation. There are other factors, there can be other factors, but bad diet, is one of the chief ones. And all that sugar, which causes all kinds of problems in the body, comes from the white stuff, processed foods. So if you look at charts of diseases and their genesis, I mean, it's extraordinary to think that cancer was hardly, really not well known, say around the turn of the century. Heart disease wasn't as well known around the turn of the century. There were other things. People died from infectious diseases, but these degenerative diseases weren't so popular. That's and true. Their rise mirrors the rise of processed foods. So it all makes a lot of sense.
And that started to happen round about, with the sort of flourishing of the industrial age, where by 1860, 1870, people were moving to urban environments, and we were seeing loads more processed foods starting to appear to feed the growing population. I mean, this then accelerated in the 20s and 30s as industrial processes became more sophisticated and were able to produce this food in greater quantity. But it did start by 1870. It was the first time when bread was not made to the original ways. And it's very interesting because you said that. I mean, we've done a comparison with the diet in 1860, and as you rightly say, none of these degenerative diseases were hardly around at all. I mean, they did exist, of course. People did die of cancer and they did die of heart problems, but it wasn't the epidemic by any means that it is today.
No.
But as you say, they weren't living it much longer, if at all, because of the viral problems that were spread as well, and that was down to poor hygiene, sanitation, all those things. But whilst on the subject of longevity, Lynn, I mean, it is a fascinating topic, and we're seeing, as I said earlier, that the people are living to 100. It's not so unusual now. It's not an impossible ambition to have. And now people are starting to stretch this to 120. Well, and it's starting to see that happen. We're starting to see people living certainly into their early hundreds, and now saying, well, the next ambition beyond that is 120. But it stretches further. This is what's interesting, that researchers from a Mount Desert Island biological laboratory reckon that, in theory at least, human beings could live to 500. And they've been doing some experiments with worms, which apparently are always used for anti-aging experiments, and discover there is 2 cellular pathways that determine how long we will live. And it's not anything to do with genes, because for years and years researchers have been looking for the aging gene that determines how long we live. And they said, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with these cellular pathways, which are known as IIS, which is insulin signaling pathway, and TOR. And these combined have an incredible effect. When they work synergistically, they have a magnifying effect, and that's what amazed the researchers. So it wasn't that they estimate that on that basis, just working with worms, that it wasn't a case of, oh, you'd live for another 10, 15, 20 years. No, it was an explosion of potential that people could live as long as 500 if we just get this working properly, which, not surprisingly, is their next big project. So it's an extraordinary thought that could it really be possible that human beings could live as long as that? I mean, we just looked at, well, if you eat a decent diet, you're going to be maybe hit 100, but 500. I mean, the thing is, we don't really know, well, but how do we actually activate these pathways to create this synergistic effect where we would actually live that long? And indeed, I suppose the question also is, did you want to?
Depends on the state of my teeth, Brian, I think, and just about everything else. But one of the interesting things about this, when you think about longevity, we've talked a lot about diet on this podcast, and that's a real key element. And we talked a bit about exercise, and while that might not help you lose weight, that's certainly key to keeping a lot of aerobic capacity and your muscles intact and your bones strong, etc., etc. But another thing that people have to recognize too is a big chief cause of early mortality is medicine, is conventional drugs. Now, there are reasons why drugs are life-saving and can be really fantastic, and I don't want to demean that. But so many drugs taken for chronic conditions have untoward and very serious side effects. And they certainly see in the older people, when they're on a cocktail of drugs, that's a big reason for the onset of Alzheimer's and dementia and so many other conditions that aren't linked to the drug, that don't get linked to the drug, but the drug is causing it. So probably when you start looking at those blue zones, although they have different diets, very radically different diets, they have a couple of factors in common, and one of them is unprocessed food. Fresh food, fresh local food. They do that really well. But and of course, a lot of activity. Some of those goat herders in Sardinia are still doing that at 90.
Yeah.
But the other thing is close community ties. This is something close to my own heart because I've seen the transformational power of small community. And community is a real protector against disease. having close family ties, belonging somewhere, protects us from heart attack, stroke, even the common cold.
Yeah.
So if you want to live to 100, or 500, do a few of those things of not processed food, exercise, close community, watch out for drugs, and stay curious.
That's very good. And Japan is the home of most of the world's centenarians. And researchers did special study into Japan and why that is. And they came up with 5 golden rules for a long and healthy life. And you mentioned most of those things, Lynn. I mean, diet certainly played a part, but it was only 1/5 of the part. It was just 20% of the issue. And it was these other aspects, which, of course, these researchers never really talk about, which do include community, so important. But it's also having this spiritual aspect, for want of a better term, where, you're serving something bigger and better than yourself. That's important. And a need to, I suppose, be of service, and the importance of, say, having a point to your life. There's a reason why I get up every day, and you need that. I do it because it could be because I'm helping other people. People depend on me. What I'm doing is worthwhile. It's helping other people. There's a point to my life, and that is a big, big driver of this. And it was one of the 5 golden keys to longevity, which, unfortunately, medical researchers never really look at, but these other researchers felt was incredibly important.
Absolutely essential.